want to continue that thread, but one of the things you said at the start of this conversation was about your mother's, she got sick.
Mm-hmm.
I read that you remember the day when you realized that she was depressed.
Yep.
How did that shape your views on happiness and fulfillment and depression, and how we ultimately end up in a situation where we're suffering with depression? Was that at all, did that influence your view on happiness, watching your mother become depressed?
Yeah, my mom wasn't severely depressed, but I remember, and that's one of the wonderful things about a liberal arts education. I took psychology, and they started talking about clinical depression and what it meant. And I realized that's what my mom was suffering from. And depression is sort of the cancer of our generation, and that is, it used to be closeted, and now people are openly talking about it. And it's really helpful, because I wish I'd known what my mom was going through earlier. Because you immediately, we're a narcissistic species. You immediately think it's something you've done. It's not about you usually, it's about them. And also, life isn't about what happens to you, it's about how you respond to what happens to you. And I think it's very helpful when you recognize depression and understand it and recognize it in other people, because what you then realize is that when you're feeling really down, a lot of times it's not your fault. You may have substantial reason to be depressed, but you may not. A lot of it is about your chemistry that day. And also to recognize that this too shall pass, that nothing, a saying that's been really important to me, and it's one of the few sayings that's always kind of held its water for me, is nothing is ever as good or as bad as it seems. When you feel like you're killing it, when you feel like you're on top of the world, that's absolutely the time to bring in your horns and be humble and grateful and realize a lot of your success isn't your fault. You just got lucky. And at the same time, when you're upset, when you're angry at yourself, when you're depressed, when you feel like everything's just black, it's not. That's temporary. And it's comforting to know that that will pass. Understanding that what my mom was going through was external, that it wasn't because things are so bad for us or so bad for her, that this was a chemical thing, this was like catching a cold. That was really liberating and helpful, not only to manage the situation in our household, but to recognize when I was down, and also to recognize that I was probably going to be more prone or vulnerable to that type of depression. But just being aware of these things, you're a young man. When I was a kid, we didn't talk about depression. We used to call it a nervous breakdown, and it was a sign of weakness, and it only happened to women, right? They were the weaker gender, and they had something called a nervous breakdown. That was what mental health, that's what depression was called back then. And then slowly but surely, people started to acknowledge that it was a thing, that it was no different than any other type of illness, that it was treatable, and that it wasn't a sign of shame. So it was really helpful for me. It was liberating to kind of understand it and realize that it wasn't totally a function of our situation or an indication of how good or bad things were at the time.
One of the things you talk about in your new book, Adrift, is this decay of community in our lives.
Yeah. And
community seems like such a human thing.
Yeah.
So when I read that, I thought maybe that's in part of the cause or factor of why we're seeing a lot of unhappiness, depression, and these things. What's your take on that?
100%. Do you have dogs? I know you don't have kids.
Yeah, I do. I have a dog upstairs.
So look, dogs just want to be around other beings, and mammals are social. We're very social. We, from a young age, we suckle. We just want to. My dogs lie on top of each other. I mean, we're meant to be around each other, and whether it's in the U.S. enrollment in Boy and Girl Scouts is off by like 40%. Church attendance is way down. The percentage of people who speak to their neighbors is off like 40%. If you just think about COVID, we don't go to the mall, we don't go to the movie theaters, right? We're becoming more and more segregated by income class. The number of kids who see their friends every day has been cut in half in the last 10 years. So we're just not touching, smelling, and feeling each other nearly as much. And I think that's directly correlated to happiness. My youngest really struggled with COVID, and we always said, well, it's because he's not in school, because the schools were closed for a while. And I thought, more than school, what my kid needs is other kids. And that is, you need guardrails, you need people around you. I think of those Japanese soldiers who retreated into the hills of the Philippines with orders to not give up the island. When the Japanese withdrew from the Philippine Islands in the South Pacific, they left behind some of these soldiers. Some of them were there for 20 or 30 years. And they refused to give up their commission until they would have to find the commanding officer, take them to the island and tell them, come down, the war's been over for 25 years. These individuals accomplished nothing. They didn't grow spiritually, physically. They didn't learn anything. They had nothing to share with anyone after their 25 years. So being alone is one of the worst things on an extended basis that can happen to a human. And every day, one of the worst things that can happen to a human is happening more and more to all of us in Western society. And it's especially prevalent among kids, the lack of socialization, and then this kind of hyper socialization that takes place on their phone, which is really brutal and has huge externalities, is, I think, one of the biggest causes for the massive uptick in depression among young people. So again, I like to coach younger people. I'm like, put yourself in a position where you have to be around other people every day, building something in the agency of something else, whether it's a job, whether it's a nonprofit, whether it's church, whether it's a sports league. Be in the agency of others, building something bigger than all of you. And it's a great way to make friends, mentors. It's a great way to learn how to read the room. I joined a fraternity when I went to UCLA when I was 17, and people make a cartoon of fraternity. Like, we're all these terrible people. It was the best thing I could have done. I had no male role models until the age of 17. My dad wasn't around. I didn't have many friends. So being in a place that shrunk a 30,000 person campus down to a smaller thing, I wouldn't have graduated. And it was hard for me. My quote unquote fraternity brothers gave me a hard time, but it was really good for me. You know, you get in better shape. I remember my roommates telling me to stop smoking so much pot and go to class more. I mean, you have people watching you 24/7. I needed that socialization. So I think one of the worst things that can happen to a young adult is for them to be isolated, and we're increasingly isolated.